Greetings to the brightest audience in the country and welcome to the Dominic Inyart Show. Today we are continuing our worldview series. Having a solid worldview is critical as it will serve to be the foundation for our lives. We have to set for ourselves a set of standards and principles and use this set of standards and principles as a guide to show us how to live our lives. This set of principles and standards, it forms our worldview, and it is critical that we make our worldview as strong as possible. It is the foundation of our lives. And if the foundation is weak and we build on it regardless, everything will end up come tumbling down. As I pointed out yesterday, even the smallest minuscule crack in that foundation, after you build on that crack for years and years and years, for the next 50 years of your life, that crack will grow and grow and grow, and under the pressure, eventually it will tear everything apart. And so it is critical that we must have a rock solid foundation which we can use to build our lives. And as we formulate this worldview, this foundation, we have three rules that we have to follow. The first rule is that the worldview which we're building, it must be consistent with reality, right? Your worldview, it's how you view the world. It must be consistent with the world. That seems pretty straightforward. And if it is not consistent with the world, then it's a bad worldview. Rule number two, the worldview which we are building, it must be consistent with itself, right? You'd be surprised at the number of people who are willing to simply put up with inconsistencies in their beliefs. You confront them, you say, hey, you're holding these two contradictory ideas, and they kind of just stare at you blankly. But we are not going to do that as we build our worldview, because we know that inconsistencies are weaknesses, and rather than just be fine with those, we are going to fix them as they come up. Number three, at your worldview, the worldview that we are defending, that we are making, it must be defendable, right? If your worldview can be destroyed in 8 seconds or less, then it is a bad worldview. And if you want to know whether or not your worldview is solid, whether or not it's good or bad, here are two signs to help show you that it's solid. The first sign is that when things get rough in life and you follow your worldview regardless, and you follow your set of principles and standards, you follow that regardless, things will be bearable. They will improve. And when life gets rough, if you have a good worldview, that will help you to not snap, to not lose it, right? If a house is built on a firm foundation and then a mighty wind comes to knock it down, the house will prevail because it was built on that firm foundation. And that's just like that with people. When they are set on a firm foundation and then difficulties come in life, they will not snap. They will not just break in two. They will not just give up and die. And a lot of people, weak people, if they do not have a firm foundation, when tough times come, either they die, that's one option, or other strong people who do have a firm foundation are burdened with this extra burden of taking care of them. And so we want to be the people with a firm foundation who are strong and grounded in truth, grounded in reality, so that when disaster comes knocking, we can stand firm. And so building a foundation, building this firm set of principles, it will protect you in life. That's one way to tell that your foundation is solid, is if it's been tested. And if it's been tested, then that helps to know. But if you get knocked over, then you probably have a pretty weak foundation. Number two, the second sign to tell if your worldview is a good worldview or a bad worldview is that you enjoy thinking about it. You think it's fun to just to ponder it. And now this isn't very intuitive, but if you enjoy thinking about your worldview, if you enjoy thinking about just how it is that you view the world, and you think about it often, you will probably have a pretty good worldview. And why is that? Why is that? Well, when you are formulating a worldview that is consistent with itself, that takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. And when you enjoy thinking about it, you just very naturally you will think about it more and more. And the more you think about it, the more inconsistencies you will find within it, right? When you start making your own worldview, you start off pretty small with pretty direct and forward questions and answers. For example, does God exist? That question is simple enough. But then you add on a little bit here, a little bit there, and you keep adding, and eventually your worldview, it has a lot of components to it. And these components you have, the more and more you have, the easier it is for you to accidentally contradict yourself. The more ideas you have, the harder it is to stay consistent. And so it requires a lot of constant scanning, if you will, a constant reassessment to find any of these inconsistencies. And if you enjoy thinking about your worldview, very naturally, you will be scanning it all the time, and you will be thinking about it more, and that will help you to fix any errors. And there's a fun little oddity of human nature, which is that we love being right. It feels so good to be right, to know that you're right, especially when you're in an argument, right? To know that you're right, to know why it is that you're right. And so the more that you work on your worldview, the more you study it, the more right you will be. And that makes you enjoy studying it all the more. And then the more you study it, then the more right you'll be. And it creates this positive feedback loop. And it's interesting. Have you ever known someone who believes, for the most part, all of the same things that you believe, but that person cannot defend their beliefs? Well, it's interesting because you think that he's right about everything, but he can't follow rule number 3, which is that you should be able to defend your beliefs. And if you are like that and you have a worldview and you know what it is that you believe, but you don't know why you believe it, that is a sign that your worldview is probably pretty bad, right? There's a chance just by luck that you just hit every issue, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's just by totally random chance. It's possible that happened and that you got all the right answers, but realistically, probably not. And if you can't defend your beliefs, then, well, they're probably wrong. Just realistically speaking, they're probably wrong. And what you'll begin to learn as you study and try to defend your beliefs, what you'll find out a few things. One, you'll find out that you are wrong about a lot. And as you figure that out, you'll change it, which is healthy. And two, you start to enjoy this process of thinking through your worldview. It's fun and enjoyable. And I know me and my brother Nate, we've talked about how when we'll be driving, a lot of people, they listen to the radio or Bluetooth or whatever. We'll turn off the radio if we have a 20-minute drive. And as we're driving, we'll just think, I have to think about things. I have to think about a worldview. What's a good thing to think about? And then we'll just choose something, and then we'll think about that. And we'll say, okay, I have my thing to think about. I'll think about that for the next 18 minutes, the rest of the drive. And it becomes fun to do. And we'll think about, what should I think about? But so you begin to enjoy it. And then once you start to enjoy it, then you become better at it. And when you are thinking about your worldview, it's like a muscle. And the more you do it, the better at thinking about it you will become, and the more fun it will be. And then if you don't think about it very much, then you will not enjoy thinking about it as much. But so yesterday, we began to formulate our worldview, and we asked the question, how did the universe get here? And this is a very simple question, simple in that it's very direct, very clear what it means. It's a very simple question, which led us to an unavoidable truth. It led us to an unavoidable truth, and that is that there is a creator. A creator of the universe exists. And we discovered using science and logic that there is a creator, and this creator is powerful, and he is personal. And now, rather than calling him the creator every time that we want to refer to him, I would prefer to have a word just for that. And so luckily, other people have already come up with a word to describe this creator, and the word that we will use is God. God is the name we will give this creator. And so A belief in God is proven scientifically and logically, right? As Conan Doyle said through Sherlock Holmes, remove the impossible and all that's left is possible. And now, I ended the last show by noting that not everyone would agree with me that God exists from the logic which we've presented thus far. Well, I would like to continue today by offering more evidence for the existence of God, and this will help us build our worldview. This will be a necessary ingredient in a strong, solid, bedrock solid worldview. Before I do that, it is telethon month. We are looking to raise $30,000 this month to keep us broadcasting for another year, not just here on the Dominic Enyart Show, but also the Bob Enyart Live Broadcast Classics, Theology Thursday, Real Science Radio with Fred Williams. And, the YouTube audience, you might not know this, but we broadcast on KLTT Radio in Denver, AM 670, KLTT. It's always an honor. Thank you for having us. But we're looking for $30,000 to keep us going for another year. If you at all can help, consider going to kgov.com. There should be a giant banner at the top of the site. Click on the banner, head over to the store, and consider helping out. That would go such a long way. Exciting announcement for the longtime listeners. The second edition of The Plot by Bob Enyart, the manuscript, is available. That's right. It is now finally available. Bob Enyart, he had been working on getting the second edition out for the last few years of his life. And luckily, he finished it just before his passing. So we have access to that. And we've been working with the printer for about a year now, and it's finally ready. The Plot, it was his life's work. And just, wow, yeah, it's an incredible book. Thousands have said how much it has helped them to better understand, but also to better enjoy the Bible. And we're talking about enjoying things helps you become better at understanding them, which is neat. And so that's really something else that we have this here. I want to read one review from a reader who read the book, and this is if this doesn't help you get the book, I don't know what will. He said, after the book cleared up so many problem passages, I felt that each chapter was worth its weight in gold. Weighing the manuscript, I'd estimate that each chapter's worth is about $500. Wow. Well, we did not pay this guy to say that. And the second edition, it is out now, but there is a catch. And I hear that good salesmen, they're not allowed to, they're not supposed to say that there's a catch. So I suppose I'm a bad salesman. But there is a catch. The second edition right now, it's not just available to anyone who wants a copy. You can't just get it willy-nilly. You cannot just go to our store and get it how you can most other products. Currently, the only way you can get your hands on a copy is by signing up to become a monthly sponsor. Sponsor a show every month of any level. You could do a full show, half show, third of a show. And we want to thank our monthly sponsors with this special offer. To get the book, sign up to become a monthly sponsor and let us know in the comment section of your order on kgov.com. You click on the banner at the top of the site, and then you'll see become a sponsor, sponsor a show. Click on that. It's all right there. And that will also go towards our telethon to help us reach our goal and broadcast for another year. Okay. All right. I got the boring sales pitch stuff out of the way. So now we can get back to the fun stuff. Worldview, right? And the existence of God. I want to offer more evidence for the existence of God. It seems that there is a law which everyone subjects themselves to. There are multiple types of laws which we see in the universe, and each type of law has different metaphysical realities about it. And the first type of law which we see is the scientific law. And the scientific law is all around us. It encompasses the laws of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, and so on. And all matter is subject to these scientific laws, from the planets in the skies to the smallest molecules in the ground beneath us, man, animal, water, rock, stone, plant, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. All physical matter is subject to the scientific law. And that law is a law which cannot be broken. It cannot be broken. A man wished to break this law by flapping his arms and flying like a bird, But no matter how rebellious his intent is, no matter how much he wishes to break this law, he will find himself fully unable. And this is not an arbitrary law designed or concocted by humans, but is part of reality. It is baked into existence, so to speak. Now, if someone claims to have broken this law, you can, for the most part, ignore them because they're quacks, because it is an unbreakable law. The next type of law we find ourselves with is governmental law. And governments around the world, they decide, here you're not allowed to do some things. You can't do them. And this law, it applies not to all matter, not to all the planets in the sky, not to animals, not to water. While this law applies only to specific humans, not to all humankind, but only to specific humans within that government's jurisdiction. Only to humans within that government's borders. And while the laws of science, they cannot be broken, the governmental laws can be broken. And if a law is broken, action will be taken to punish the citizen who broke the law. And this is done as a way to discourage people from breaking the law, the governmental law. Some countries are more strict than others, and some countries have populations who will break the law more than other countries, right? A man, he may wish to break the law, and he is able to do so, but depending on the situation, it may or may not be rather difficult to do so. This law, while in its purest form, would be like the scientific law. In its purest form, it should not be arbitrary. Sadly, we do see, cases where it often has become arbitrary, which is sad. But, some aspects of it are objective and other aspects are arbitrary. An interesting thing about this law is that when one breaks it, they typically deny that they've broken it, not because of shame or guilt that they feel, but because they wish to avoid the consequences which would be implemented by government officials. This law has some overlap with the third type of law that we see. And the third type of law that we see is the law of what we ought to do. What we ought to do, what we should do. And there is a standard for how people should behave. And this law, it applies not to physical matter, not to bugs, not to animals, not to water, not to celestial bodies, but to mankind. And this law of what we ought to do, it applies to the whole of mankind. It doesn't make any difference if you are in Las Vegas or Hong Kong. This rule, this law, it applies to everyone nonetheless. It is what one ought to do. By the way, that word ought, it implies something. That word ought implies you can do something. If you ought to do something, then you can do that very same thing. Some silly philosophers like to say that there are some things you ought to do, but you are unable to do. This is ridiculous. It is unreasonable to expect someone to follow the law of what they ought to do when they cannot do it. And the silly ideas of these philosophers, they can be disregarded without too much thought. Regardless, this law of what one ought to do is the law that is the most often broken. And it is often broken because people believe there will be little to no consequence if they break this law. And like governmental law, if someone breaks this law, they'll typically deny that they've broken it. And now that's not because they fear the consequences from some governing officials, but because they do, in fact, feel some level of guilt or shame. Now, if someone were to break both governmental law and the law of what we ought to do simultaneously, if they do that, they may deny that they have broken these laws. And they may deny this because both of the consequences they're afraid of from the government and because they feel shame. But in many cases, they may, you're rude to someone and you ought not to be rude. And then someone says, hey, you were being rude. And then they deny that they were being rude. That is They're denying it, not because they're afraid of the governmental consequences, but they dislike the shame and guilt that come with that, so they deny it. All of mankind recognizes this law. Every time that we hear two people fighting about an issue, they're making claims about this law. Right? You hear like, "Oh, dude, you can't do that. That's so messed up," or "Oh, you can't have my seat. I was there first," or "Oh, why does my brother Jim get ice cream but I don't?" And while they have differing views and beliefs about this law, about what we ought to do, we all recognize that this law does exist. Everyone, young or old, wise or foolish, criminal or lawful. I say criminal, yes, even criminals, right? A hardened drug dealer, he might have a seared conscience and he might steal some money without feeling guilt for a second. But the moment another drug dealer tries to steal from him, you can be sure that he knows that's wrong and he's going to be quick to defend what's his. And he recognizes, even through a broken perspective, that this law of what we ought to do, this law, it exists in reality. Even that drug dealer with the broken perspective, even he recognizes this. When people make claims like, this isn't fair, or, why does so-and-so get this, but I don't get that? When they're doing this, they are appealing to some standard of what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. And it's not that they're especially saying, "Oh, this one thing, it happens to displease me," but they're saying this should not be like this. There's something that the universe, it doesn't want it to be like this. They're appealing to this standard. Something interesting that you'll note if you listen in on a fight between two people, any fight of any, people quarreling, whatever it is, you'll notice that in these fights, that when people are defending themselves, this seems to be consistent. When they're defending themselves, they will say things like, "I have an excuse to not follow this standard," or "I had a horrible day at work, the wife is mad at me, yada, yada, yada." Or they might say, "Oh, because of XYZ reason, there's an exception and the standard, I don't have to follow it." But as C.S. Lewis pointed out, people very rarely will be confronted with this. And they'll say, "Well, I recognize your standard, but I don't care about it. I'm doing it anyways. Who cares about the standard?" People, they very rarely say this, though unfortunately this attitude has been growing in popularity. But even in such cases, people, they recognize that the standard exists, right? This is the law of what we ought to do. And this law, it has a name. Like scientific law and like governmental law, this law has a name. And this law is called the moral law. And like scientific law, it is objective. It is not arbitrary. It exists in reality. And unlike the law of a country, you cannot escape it by leaving the country's borders. You cannot leave its jurisdiction. You are still subject to this law when you are sailing on international waters. Elon Musk, when he goes to Mars, if he ever makes it there, he will still be subject to this law. Now, all rational people agree that this law exists. Yet there are some who claim that this law is not objective. They say it is arbitrary. And these claims, when people make claims like these are claims which must be dealt with. They must be harshly refuted and condemned, as they have wrought some of the most deadly disasters of all time. They have brought in some of the most disastrous consequences of all time. And we're talking about having a worldview that is firm and solid. And the question of this law, this moral law, it makes up a significant part of the foundation, whether or not it is, is it objective or is it arbitrary? And if you get this wrong, if you get this part of your worldview wrong, it has the potential to bring such massive amounts of pain and suffering to so many people. It has before, and it will again if we make the same mistake. And this law, it is very important to understand this, it is not arbitrary, it is objective. The moral law of what one ought to do, it does not change century by century. It does not change minute by minute. It does not change. It is consistent. It is always the case. if you think it is arbitrary and it does change, it is fluid, I would ask that you consider this and ask yourself these questions. Was Hitler objectively wrong for killing 6 million Jews? Was Hitler objectively wrong for killing 6 million Jews? How about this question? Were slaveholders, were they objectively wrong for how they owned other men as property, how they owned other men, women, and children as property? Was that objectively wrong? If you cannot bring yourself to say, yes, those things are objectively wrong, then you are a fool. You are so lost in the abyss of your own insanity. I don't think that there's much I can say which will help you find the light. What I can tell you is that if someone were to ever kidnap you and to own you as property, to own you as a slave, to denigrate you to merely, a physical slab of meat, if they were to do that to you, you would learn very quickly that is objectively wrong. Not that it's wrong because it happens to displease you, but you will intuitively know that this violates a standard which is above even your discomfort. There's a higher standard which that violates. And so I hope that you can come to see that these things are objectively wrong. If you can't, there's not much I can say to you, only that I hope you change your mind, and you change your mind both for the sake of yourself and those around you. I think you are a danger to society because people who've believed what you believe they've brought unquantifiably large amounts of damage to the world. And for today's show, I'm going to turn my attention away from you, and I will turn my attention back toward those who answered the questions correctly, towards those who said, yes, Hitler was absolutely wrong for killing 6 million Jews. Yes, the slave owners were wrong for owning men as property. To these people, you are correct. You have shown wisdom. Although, now you must accept another reality. And that reality is that this standard, this moral law, this rule of what we ought to do, it is not arbitrary. You cannot both say that what Hitler did was objectively wrong and there is no such thing as objectively wrong. That would be a contradiction. That would violate our second rule. Your worldview must be consistent with itself. So let's review. We have 3 types of laws. We have the scientific law, we have the governmental law, and we have the moral law. We have observed all 3 of these. The moral law, it applies to everyone. Everyone recognizes it, though some people disagree with the various aspects about it, but they all agree that it exists nonetheless. This is the moral law of reality, and it is objective. And while in the first show, we found ourselves faced with the question, how did the universe get here? Now we are faced with a similar question. How did the objective moral law get here? And I hate to spoil the ending, but the answer is the same. If we think about this, we can use a similar method, which we used in the last show. We can use a similar method to figure out where this law comes from. We can list all the possible theories as to where this law comes from, and then play a game I like to call the process of elimination. There are multiple theories, and we go through them, and we remove the ones which are incorrect. And it seems that there are 4 main theories as to how this law, this standard, what we ought to do. There are 4 theories about how this standard got here. The first is that this law was made by governments. Essentially, the law of what we ought to do and governmental law are one and the same. Number 2, the second theory, is that this law was made by humans and it's merely a cultural construct. The third theory about how we got this theory, this standard, is that This law was created by evolution, and evolution taught us this law because it helps us to further the human species. That's the third theory. And the fourth theory is that this law was made by God. And so we shall use Conan Doyle's process here. And what he said through Sherlock Holmes, remove the impossible and all that's left is possible. So the process of elimination, pretty simple stuff. We can take a look at each one of these. The first theory, the moral law, this moral standard, it was created by governments. That's the first theory. And we know right off the bat, this is not the case because governments, they have violated this standard more than any other group or organization. And we recognize that, right? Hitler in the 1940s, he was in charge of Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany, that was a government who slaughtered millions of Jews, yet we still recognize that they were wrong. And when Americans today, when we criticize Nazis, which rightly so, it's good to criticize Nazis, when we do that, we do not say, oh, hey, that was wrong because that violates the U.S. Constitution today. That's not our logic. That's not the reasoning for why we condemn the Nazis. No, what we do say, correctly so, is we say, wow, that's evil. That violates our rule of what we ought to do. We ought not to do that. And if no government had ever existed, we would still be able to recognize right from wrong. We would recognize what we ought to do. TV shows that depict anarchy, they show this to be the case, right? Though only fiction, these stories, they help convey that we are still under this moral law, even when there is no government present. If you are on international waters, you still understand that raping another man's wife is wrong. That standard does not come from the government. The second theory about how this moral law came to be. The standard, this theory says that the standard is made by man and that it's merely a cultural construct. That's what people will say. It's a cultural construct. That's where this standard comes from. Well, Nazi Germany is another, it serves twice as a good example to disprove this notion. Because slaughtering Jews, not just was it something that the government did, but it was part of the culture, right? They were not bothered by it. When you saw a Jew, if you were a Nazi living in Germany, a civilian Nazi, you would report that Jew to the authorities so that they would be punished. And there are some really horrifying images of Nazis working at concentration camps. And, they're smoking a cigarette, talking to their friends, laughing about, whatever, just chatting. Just another day in the office for them. And in the background, you see just right next to them, there are hundreds of Jews being buried alive. And they're just smoking a cigarette, laughing like nothing's going on. That was their cultural construct. It was normal. It was fine according to their culture. In their time period, that was acceptable. Of course, we now recognize that was wrong, that violates the law of what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. And we recognize that culture, what they believed about the moral law, we recognize today that what they thought was wrong. What they thought about this moral law, it violated the moral law. And I've noticed something fascinating about all these people who claim that morality, this moral law, is a cultural construct. They say that this standard is dependent on the culture and the time that people were living in. That's their claim. Yet these same people, in America at least, these same people, they tend to be in favor of tearing down, say, statues of our founding fathers because of their various sins. We should tear down their statues. Yet according to their beliefs, according to the beliefs of people who say it's just a cultural construct, what our founding fathers did, it did not violate the cultural standard. It did not violate that construct. And according to this theory, they did exactly what they ought to do, yet they're somehow still guilty. It doesn't make any sense. Of course, in reality, the people who espouse this theory, They understand that it's false. They acknowledge that this standard of what we ought to do, they recognize, they realize that it doesn't change minute to minute, day by day, year by year, century by century. They recognize that, and they do not have the courage of their convictions in this theory. If they did, they would say, what Hitler did was fine and we should accept it. That was the culture at the time. That's what they would say. But for the most part, they don't say that. There are a few people who say that. And if anyone says that, if you believe that, dear viewer, if you believe that, I, Dominic Enyart, despise your character, and I have very little hope for you that you will ever find your way to sanity. But as we've already established, the moral law is objective. Now, let's take a look at the third theory as to how we got this moral law, this moral standard of what we ought to do. We know that, the third theory is that this law was created by evolution and it helps to further the species as a whole, and it's merely a biological process. Well, we know that this is not the case because our moral law of what we ought to do and ought not to do, it very often discourages the very actions that would help to further our species. The moral law of what we ought to do discourages the actions, I'm saying this again, which would help to further our species. Think of Genghis Khan or any rapist, or say even a man who just manipulates and tricks, say, half a dozen women into sleeping with him. These men will have children with these women and further the human species. And I don't want to get too technical here. I don't want to throw too many facts around, but get this. Babies come from sex. I don't want to get too technical, but sex equals babies. That's pretty simple. And these men who are doing whatever they want, whatever they can just to have sex, this helps to further the human species. Yet we still recognize that these people, they are in violation of the moral law. They are in violation of the law of what we ought to do. The theory of evolution creating moral law, it does not explain this phenomena. It also does not explain why other things might be wrong, other things that don't have to do with furthering the human species at all, right? Say lying, for example. If you are a kid and you're lying to your parents about where you were last night, that is wrong. That violates the law of what we ought to do, even though that will not hinder the human species. It won't hinder the human species at all. Yet, evolution cannot describe how that would hinder the human species, yet we know that is wrong. We recognize that is wrong. Let's take a look at another example. Say eugenics. Eugenics, that is the practice of selectively breeding people who have the most desirable traits in humanity, and then not allowing others to reproduce. Thus, this would strengthen the gene pool. This is the theory. This is what Margaret Sanger thought we should do, and that's why she founded the American Birth Control League, I believe it was called. That's what Hitler did, and we recognize that this is evil. We recognize that this is wrong, even though it could dramatically help the human population. It could help the human gene pool, the human species. Yet we still recognize that it's wrong. Remember that the arguments against the eugenics, the argument against it, it's not, hey, eugenics doesn't work. That's not the argument against it. Because if it did work, that doesn't mean it's acceptable now that it works. The argument against eugenics is, hey, this is evil. This is unethical. This violates the law of what we ought to do. The argument against something that would further help the human species is that this violates the law of what we ought to do. All right, let's take a look at the fourth theory for how we got this moral law. The fourth theory, the one I espouse, is that this moral law, it was given to us by God. We have exhausted all other possibilities. We have exhausted all the other theories, and we are left only with God. Only God can create a moral law that all humanity is subject to. Only God can write that law of what we ought to do onto our hearts. I haven't even taken us to the Christian God yet, but just a God. Just a God. This is the only possible explanation. Take away all the impossible, and all that's left is possible. At this point, many will object and they will say things like, I don't like this God. He's violated his own standard. But we haven't even gotten that far yet. We haven't even gotten to a Christian God. You're arguing against a Christian God. And in our journey here, building a worldview, we have not yet arrived at the God of Christianity. When we do, I shall defend him from your attacks, from your objections. But we have not arrived there yet, so your objection must wait. We also hear other people who say, well, I don't like this standard. I don't like the idea of God. I don't like this standard. But whether or not you like it, that is besides the point. We are just establishing that it merely exists. And both of these objections and other similar objections, it's ironic because they concede the point entirely. They concede that there is a standard, which is an objective moral standard, and they say, right, they may dislike the standard. It's a standard that exists, which they dislike. They may think that they may incorrectly think that God has violated the standard that exists. But those objections require you to believe that these very standards do in fact exist. You cannot violate a non-existent law. You cannot violate a non-existent standard. That leaves us with a standard, a law of what we ought to do, a moral law. This moral law, it was made by God. That is the only possible explanation. All other explanations fall short. All other explanations are horrible. You can either deny the existence of this moral law, which that's a disaster. You can't do that. Or you could say, oh, it's not God. It's some other, crazy theory that we just, random whatever, and that's how we got this. And that does not make sense either. There is a moral law, an objective moral law that was made by God. That is the only possible explanation. I would like for us to review. The worldview that we have built so far is as follows. God exists and he created the universe. He is a powerful and personal creator. This God has set a moral standard. So that's 2 entire shows worth of stuff that we've done for just 3 sentences. That's a lot of content for 3 sentences, but I feel that we're pretty firm in these 3 sentences. And as we are building our worldview, the reason that we've gotten through 2 shows and only have 3 sentences to show for it is that as we are building our worldview, and I cannot stress this enough, we must be critical to get everything right. We have to hit every nail right on the head. And we must hold ourselves to extremely high standards as we construct the foundation for our lives. And that is why I want to move extremely slowly through this process of building our worldview. So we've done 2 shows. We have 3 sentences to show for it. But these 3 sentences, they make a really good, first stepping stone that we can use in our foundation. We will continue this series next week. In the meantime, make sure to check out kigof.com tomorrow for Theology Thursday. On Friday, Real Science Radio. We have a really big announcement right there at the top of the show. That should be really fun. You guys will be excited to hear that. And then next week, Monday, for our BEL Broadcast Classics. And then, of course, next Tuesday for the continuation of this series with me here on the Dominic Enyart Show. All right, I want to remind you guys that we are in our telethon month. We are looking to raise $30,000 this month to keep us broadcasting for another year. We are currently at $1,700. I want to thank David H. from Canton, Ohio. He really came in big time. David, thank you. Wow, what a blessing. That is extremely humbling. Thank you, David, so much. We also have Scott S. from Centennial, Colorado. Scott, he wrote a funny little note here. He He says, imagine one day God came down just to correct us on a single issue. He comes down, opens the sky, and says, guys, it's actually pronounced Jod. And then he ascends. And so that got a chuckle out of me, referring to the whole is it pronounced GIF or GIF conversation. And then also a thank you to Eric D. from Fort Collins, Colorado. Thank you guys so much for your support. Just reaching out to the show, helping us stay online and broadcasting for another year. We really could not do this without you guys, us producing this show. It's, we're going to do this until we die or until you guys, stop helping out. And so thank you guys so much, especially all you guys who supported recently. Did I accidentally just dox all of you guys? If I did, my bad. All right, that's going to do it for me here today on the Dominic Enyart Show. I will see you guys next week, and I want to remind you to do right and risk the consequences.
Do right.